Thank you, Technics, for this opportunity to participate in the conference. I've titled the paper Fictioning and Ethics of Transindividuation. And to theorize this notion of an ethics of transindividuation in terms of fiction, the aim here will be to see a transductive relation between technics and ethics at the interface of fiction. I'll try to propose an understanding of fiction as fingere, as the figuration of modes of becoming that are conditioned both by tertiary tensions and by the other, or by alterity. Fictioning and ethics of transindividuation will then lead us into the fragile work of calculating the incalculable, that is, critique. And towards the end, I'll touch on two current debates wherein the ethical stakes of such critique become evident, as bioethics and cognitive capitalism. In the transindividuating transduction between Heidegger's Dasein and Simondon's pre-individual through tertiary retention, what is forgotten in this psychic collective dynamic is the other. It is the presence of the other that disrupts both the I in the solitude of being and the we of collective individuation, thereby rupturing the psychic collective duality. So how do we think about this other vis-a-vis physiological, technical, and social organs? At first, technics as the condition of access to the pre-individual reserve may seem at odds with ethics as pre-original responsibility. Perhaps to put it too simply, for one, to be human is to always and already have been in relation with the machinic, while for the other, to be human is to always and already have been in relation with an other that, however indeterminable it may be, is a human other. But this dynamic of technics and ethics is perhaps less in opposition than in proximity. So the question is how to think about the other vis-a-vis human relations that exist prosthetically and artificially. 3 points of modulation may help to launch a preliminary attempt at trying to think a transductive relation between ethics and technics. And these 3 points are expression, sense, and desire. So first, expression. In expression, the disparate terms of tertiary retention and the face of the other coincide. The naked and destitute expression of the other's face calls my sense into question. The expression is the beginning of speech, the speech gesture, that becomes the technical support for the expansion of sense. In the becoming symbolic of individuation, sensibility becomes exclamatory expression, as Steeler describes, an incommensurable singularity. And as for Levinas, the face expresses or exclaims in its singular expression as sensational before sensible. The straightforward, upright expression of the face attends its own expression without reference to an intelligible meaning hidden behind it. The face expresses in as much as it does not express something, but opens up to a sensational encounter irreducible to my perception. In this encounter, in the becoming symbolic of individuation, my perception and sense expand. The face expresses its sensational expression, altering the sensible. The sensible then becomes sensational through the technical support for the passage from the ordinary to the extraordinary. And secondly, sense. If my sense expands on the condition of technics, this sense is also a primordial orientation towards the other, an élan, a propulsion, a leap towards the other, which Martin Crowley talked about as well yesterday. Once again, technics and ethics resonate with and against each other. In terms of technics, the sense is the concretizing process of the metastable individual through tertiary retentions. In terms of ethics, sense orients the multiplicity of cultural significations through a movement of one towards the other. Sense then concretizes and orients exteriorization. Concretizing and orienting, this dynamic of determining the undetermined, characterizes both the ethical movement towards the other and the technical condition for the individuation of signification. And third, between the determination of primordial orientation and undetermined individuation lies desire. Desire circulates in the incompletion of transindividuation, in the unending movement towards the absolutely other that doesn't interest me in the first place. It is a movement that does not return to me as the origin of some need, hence a movement vis-a-vis the ingratitude of the absolute other that remains untouched and unaffected. Our prosthetic mode of becoming is ever deferred because desire is a desire of the absolutely other. This incompletion of transindividuation maintains what Siegler calls extreme fragility in De la misère symbolique. The individuation of signification through sense occurs in this extremely fragile movement from the pre-individual reserve that we might call the common or the general intellect to individuation, the multitude of singularities. Whereas design operates in the evening hour leveling down of differences between one's own design and others, difference is the aim of the unending process of psychic and collective individuation. The grammar of the multitude then, according to Virno, is not the given point of departure, but the point of arrival. The encounter with the other gives rise to the singularizing process of individuation that requires the determination of the undetermined. The very appearance of indeterminable alterity requires singularizing and individuating in orientation, oriented propulsion out of the realm of the pre-individual. Ethics, then, is not without violence or conflict. The presence of the other violently disrupts the attentional forms of knowledge that are passed down through generations and that become unified habits, disciplines, and institutional organs. The other disrupts this possibility of the collective in collective individuation. But it is in this disruption and in this impossibility of the collective that the work of paying attention to, that the work of turning towards and taking care never ceases. At this conjuncture, then, we can conceive of figuring in ethics of transindividuation in terms of fiction as fingere, to figure, to fashion, to make, or to mold. Fiction appeals to a dimension of grammatizing language that maintains the tension between the technicalities of discrete units and the indeterminateness of meaning. Fiction fabricates in the sense of the extravagant or the beyond, but it also operates within the mechanics of language. Fiction explores the realities of the material world, yet also limits infinite supplements. So as such, the work of fiction, its simultaneous figuration and disfiguration, allows us to consider the metastable individual that is in excess of itself, always changing and becoming, yet also concretely embodied in the world. The fictive construction of transindividuation is an economy of care that does not end in a political science, a political unified adequation, but rather continues and never ends in productive thought. Never ending because of the extreme fragility that knows no closure. This extreme fragility can be expressed in three coincidences of this term figure, which is at the basis of fiction. That's the coincidence of the facial figure and absolute alterity at the heart of Levinas's ethics. There's also the coincidence of the numeric figure of calculation and incalculability. And lastly, the coincidence of the symbolic figure of signification, linguistically, and indeterminacy. The metastable individual relies on the crutch of tertiary tension in the fragile coincidence of the exorbitant yet exact, singularly plural accesses to the world in Jean-Luc Nancy's terms. For individuation to occur, there must also be a loss of individuation. In terms of ethics, the calculable must also be calculated. To attend to the other in fiction is also to deface the absolute other in terms of concrete figures. Attention, in the sense of being towards the other, is not an ontologically fixed state of technologically conditioned forms of knowledge. Attention is the process of turning towards alterity that requires, yet exceeds, calculated techniques. the figuration of calculated material life in the face of incalculability, that is, projection, describes the perception of the other's physical existence and the interruption of this perception by the other's alterity that is beyond cognition. And without this extreme fragility at the heart of pharmacological critique, there would be no thought. So contrary to what the authors Arvidsson and Peterson suggest in their book, The Ethical Economy, ethics does not found a new common value regime for the contemporary age of digital technology and financialization. And here is a sense of ethics that does not have to do with morality or moral standards. Such value regimes would reduce ethics into a mere moral program to be applied to processes of technical individuation. Ethics, rather, is the attention that keeps us in the act of putting into question, without ever arriving at a final answer, the transformation of the technical individual. And Stiegler speaks of this in terms of a critical process that transforms conditions that are already there. The question then is whether transindividuation is conceived on the basis of the determination of what is already there, or on the basis of the undetermined affirmation of the hypothesized individual, this I that surges out of that, or that is born out of itself. So one debate in which the ethical stakes of attention and critique become evident is the theory of subjectivity and cognitive capitalism. Theorists of cognitive capitalism and the common underscore the double status of the cognitive and social relations as both the source and the product of innovation. Languages, affects, images, sounds, and ideas, which are the source of mass intellectuality, are also appropriated as products of the mass intellect and as functional market commodities. The result is a confusion of the object of knowledge and the one who seeks to know. The intellectual worker engaged in immaterial labor, as Lazzarato has defined, is a consumer laborer whose subjective processes are reproduced by communication technologies and that become inserted within the market cycle of production and consumption. The exploitation, conditioning, and programming of aesthetic sensibilities by industrial technologies yields consumer bodies without desire. Individuation in hyperindustrialism, Stiegler states, is a disindividuation, disorientation, disenchantment, malaise, ennui, carelessness. This misery of synchronized audiovisual consumption leads to a dissolution of the I and the we into this anonymous third person one. Without the existence of individuation, disenchanted subjectivity disappears behind its own affective and cognitive functions. Human subjectivity as absence itself, or the autonomous production of subjectivity that is void of subjectivity. Human subjectivity as the Blanchotian neuter, the ilia of being, the anonymous publicness of death. So paradoxically, while the hypersynchronization of digital technologies thus tends towards the loss of individuation and the participation in the production of symbolic meaning, at the same time, cognitive capitalism relies upon this very production of symbols. The hyperindustrial controls what cannot be controlled, that is, affects, languages, images, sounds, ideas, and creative faculties. It exploits sensibilities, consciences, desires, which are the raw material for the consumer market, to then deprive subjects of their senses. So fiction, as a simultaneous process of figuration and disfiguration, helps us conceptualize a digital organology of knowledge beyond this paradox that is inherent in cognitive capitalism. While centralized organs in cognitive capitalism attempt to engineer processes of transindividuation through the exploitation of collaborative production, that the psychosocial individual is already and always in relation to the otherwise, keeps us from reducing the social relation to something that can be grammatized into metadata. The indeterminable becoming of transindividuation cannot be produced either by capitalist structures or psychopolitical organization of the common. the improbable that Blanchot locates between possibility and impossibility cannot be reduced to calculation. And in the improbable that is, continues the work of thought, the work of critique, and invention. So rather than the view of cognitive capitalism as a biopolitical production of non-subjectivities, I think Stiegler's view of the hypo-industrial conditioning of psychic and collective individuation remains more sensitive to this resistance of critical thought and the resistance of embodied beings against the synchronization of the common. Whereas the view of capturing and subsumption by technology is technological determinism, we might say the view of conditioning leaves room for thought. The possibility of transformation and the disruption of grammatization is a matter of the condition for thought. It is a question of the technical individual and the possibilities for the philia in philosophy, as Deleuze sees it. Fiction fabricates because the real itself does not sustain the human relations upon which the technological reproduction of communication depends. And it is in this fabrication the organization of the face is disfigured and transformed. There is extreme fragility, then, in the ethics of transindividuation as a humanism of the other. Ethics challenges us to attend to the alterity of the human in difference from our relation with animals and non-living organs. In Joanna Zielinska's work on bioethics, it is at this point that Stiegler and Levinas diverge. She writes in her book, Bioethics in the Age of New Media, I quote, "The one for the other structure of subjectivity in Levinas, which is for him a conjuncture in which a man is responsible for other men, needs to be expanded if under conditions of digitality we cannot ascertain any longer whether the other who is assigned to me and for whom I am responsible is human or machinic, and whether the fraternity Levinas talks about extends to all of DNA kin, chimpanzees, dogs, bacteria." While recent theorists of new media, biopolitics, and bioethics borrow from Levinas's philosophy, critics find that his humanist ethics fall short of accounting for the non-human and the non-living world. But is not the ethical event of turning towards the other precisely to ascertain, and especially under conditions of digitality, whether this other is human or machinic? That is, does infinite responsibility need to be expanded to account for the non-living world, as Zielinska argues, or on the contrary, does infinite responsibility need to be narrowed? The interface of psychic and social attention constitutes the human quality of individuation, the particularity of the human face of the other, which cannot be reduced to particularity, lies in the coincidence of the physical features of the eyes, nose, and mouth, speech, and absolute alterity. In the process of individuation through grammatization, there is a coincidence of the dire and the dit vis-a-vis the other, or the saying and the said in Levinas's terms. It is a speech encounter with the other that cannot be objectified as manifests in animals, plants, or things. The other is absolute other, not because it is absolutely different from me, on the basis, for example, of how dogs are a different species from me, or how rocks are non-living and I am living. This process of distinction results in the reduction of alterity. The other is absolute other because of the alterity of the human. It is the human of the non-human that makes me hostage to responsibility. To replace a human-centered ethics with a non-humanist ethics that views the human as an element of the continuous flow of matter, data, and life forms would only set up a dichotomy between the internal flow and what is external to it. And I wonder whether this isn't a reductionist view of alterity as whatever is outside the system flow. The coincidence of the saying and the said which characterizes the extreme fragility at the ethics of transindividuation, can also be expressed as the coincidence of the figure and the disfigure. The hypo-industrial synchronization of psychic and collective individuation Stigler proposes introduces a new figure of the individual that is disfigured, obstructed from the very processes of individuation that makes the individual possible. Individuation is possible insofar as it is at the same time a disindividuation. In Deleuze and Guattari's formulation, the human face has a future insofar as the face is dismantled, insofar as faciality traits themselves finally elude the organization of the face. New figures of the individual would be possible only when synchronized figures are disfigured, unfigured, and refigured. The ethics of dismantling the organization of the face involves an attention to concrete faciality traits, which at the same time is a violence that reduces the other's face to identification and calculation. And here is the pharmacon. The face of the other must also be, at the same time, be defaced. In the communicative relation to the other, the saying must also be fixed in the said. One way to conceive of the absolute alterity of humans as constituted and mediated by technologies, since the ethics of transindividuation requires concepts, figures, and thought, is in terms of the implication of ethics and politics in the encounter with the other. It is not up for me to say who or what the other is and to what extent, human, animal, or machine, because the other escapes such comprehension. So it's not up to me, but it is at the same time for me to say, to speak to the other and a plurality of others as embodied beings who occupy particular social and economic geographic conditions. At this conjuncture, we can conceive of the continuation of ethics and politics in hyper-industrialized, disembodied networks of communicative and cognitive functions. The ethical stakes of how a common we represent ourselves to one another in the impossibility of a we in the current symbolic misery hinge on economies of fiction that are based on modes of attention towards the humanism of the other. Thank you.